The rain had been falling for 3 hours straight, and Grace Monroe could feel every minute of it in her aching feet. The Blue Harbor Tavern sat on the corner of Ferry Street and Adams, a relic from Newark's industrial past that had somehow survived gentrification, urban renewal, and every economic downturn the city had thrown at it over the last 40 years. The neon sign outside flickered between blue and darkness, casting intermittent shadows across the wet pavement. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of beer, fried food, and decades of cigarette smoke that no amount of cleaning could ever truly erase from the wood-paneled walls. Grace pushed a strand of dark hair behind her ear and surveyed the damage. It was 1:47 a.m. on a Friday night, technically Saturday morning, and the last customers had finally stumbled out into the rain about 20 minutes ago. The bar looked like a hurricane had torn through it. Glasses covered every surface, some still half full of amber liquid or melted ice. Napkins littered the floor like confetti after a parade nobody wanted to attend. The jukebox in the corner had finally gone silent, thank God, after playing the same rotation of classic rock and blues songs it had been cycling through since Grace started working here 2 years ago. 2 years. Had it really been that long? She grabbed a gray plastic tub from behind the bar and started collecting glasses, moving methodically from table to table. Her movements were automatic now, muscle memory built from hundreds of shifts just like this one. Reach, grab, stack. Reach, grab, stack. Don't think about the burning in your calves or the way your lower back screams every time you bend over. Don't think about the fact that you're 28 years old, and this is what your life has become. The Blue Harbor had been her refuge once, back when she first moved to Newark from Scranton, back when she thought this would just be temporary, a way to make rent while she figured out her next move, maybe saved enough to go back to school, finish the nursing degree she'd abandoned when her mother got sick. That was before Mom died, before her younger brother Danny got diagnosed, before the medical bills started piling up like snow in a nor'easter, burying any hope she had of climbing out of this hole. "Grace? You almost done out there?" The voice came from the kitchen, sharp and impatient. Vincent Moretti, her boss, or at least the man who acted like her boss. Technically, the Blue Harbor was owned by some LLC with a name that changed every few years, but everyone in the neighborhood knew who really ran it. Vincent was the face, the enforcer, the man who made sure the money flowed in the right direction, and that direction always led back to the same place, the Russo family. "Almost," Grace called back, keeping her voice neutral. She'd learned early on that showing any emotion around Vincent was a mistake. Anger got you screamed at. Sadness got you mocked. Anything that looked like weakness got exploited. She heard him grunt in response, followed by the clatter of pots being thrown into the industrial sink. Vincent was in one of his moods tonight. He'd been snapping at everyone since the shift started. Grace had developed a sixth sense for reading his temper, the way sailors learned to read the sky for storms. Tonight felt different, though, more volatile, like the air pressure had dropped and something was about to break. Grace moved behind the bar and started sorting the receipts, her fingers working quickly through the slips of paper. This was always the worst part, tallying up the night's take, knowing that most of it would disappear into Vincent's pocket, then into the bigger pockets above him. The servers worked for tips, and on a good night, Grace might walk away with $150. On a bad night, barely enough to cover her bus fare and a meal. Tonight, though, her breath caught as she started counting the cash in the tip jar. Tonight was different. The bar had been packed from the moment the doors opened at 5 p.m., not with the usual regulars, the old-timers who nursed the same beer for 3 hours and tipped in quarters, but with a different crowd. Younger men in expensive suits that didn't quite fit the shabby aesthetic of the Blue Harbor. They'd taken over the back corner, ordering top-shelf liquor and talking in low voices that occasionally erupted into laughter. Grace had served them carefully, professionally, keeping her eyes down and her smile neutral. She knew the type, knew what they were celebrating even if she didn't know the specifics. In this neighborhood, men in suits gathering in dark bars only meant one kind of business, but they'd tipped well, extremely well. Her hands trembled slightly as she counted. 500, 1,000, 1,500. "Jesus," she whispered. The tip jar kept yielding bills, 20s, 50s, even a few hundreds. By the time she reached the bottom, Grace's heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she could hear it over the hum of the ancient refrigerator. $3,200, and that was just from the tip jar. She glanced toward the kitchen, where she could still hear Vincent banging around. Then she quickly pulled out the folded bills from her apron pocket. The money customers had pressed directly into her hand throughout the night, accompanied by winks or slurred thanks, or the occasional inappropriate comment she'd smiled through with gritted teeth. Another $5,300. Grace stared at the money spread across the bar like it was a hallucination. $8,500. In one night. That was more than she made in 3 months of regular shifts. That was Danny's medication for the next 6 months. That was the security deposit on a new apartment in a building where the heat actually worked. That was a plane ticket out of Newark, out of New Jersey, out of this entire suffocating existence. That was freedom. The thought hit her like a lightning strike, sudden and illuminating and terrifying. What if she just took it? The question seemed to echo in the empty bar, bouncing off the stained mirrors and dusty bottles. Grace's mouth went dry. Her fingers, still holding a stack of 50s, started to shake. It wasn't stealing, she told herself. This was tip money. Money that customers had given directly to her, for her service, for dealing with their demands and their wandering hands and their condescension. Vincent had no right to it. The house got its cut from the drinks. These tips were supposed to be hers. Except that wasn't how it worked at the Blue Harbor. Vincent had made it clear from her first week. All tips got pooled, then redistributed according to a formula only he understood. Grace usually saw about 30% of what she actually earned. The rest vanished into the same black hole that swallowed the bar's profits, the hole that fed the Russo family's empire. She'd never questioned it, never dared to, but $8,500. Grace's mind raced, calculating possibilities. If she left now, right now, she could be on a bus to Philadelphia before sunrise. From there, she could go anywhere. Pittsburgh, Columbus. Somewhere the Russo family's reach didn't extend. Danny was in a care facility in Trenton. She could arrange for his treatment to be transferred. It would be complicated, but possible. Everything was possible with money. The back door was 30 feet away, through the kitchen. Her apartment was a 15-minute walk from here. She could grab her emergency bag, the one she'd packed 6 months ago during a particularly bad night when Vincent had gotten in her face and she'd sworn she was done. She'd never used it, never had the courage. But now, Grace, what the hell is taking so long? Vincent's voice snapped her back to reality. She jumped, nearly dropping the cash. Just finishing up the count, she called back, hating how her voice cracked. Think, she commanded herself. Think clearly. If she took this money and ran, Vincent would notice immediately. He always counted the take himself, checked it against the register receipts and the bottle inventory. He'd know someone had stolen from the night's earnings. And when Vincent found out someone had stolen from him, which meant stealing from the Russo family, there would be consequences. But would he know it was her? Grace's mind spun through the scenario. There had been 4 servers working tonight. Herself, Maria, Tommy, and the new girl whose name she couldn't remember. Maria had left at 11 when her shift ended. Tommy had slipped out around midnight. He was always ducking out early, and Vincent usually let it slide because Tommy's uncle was connected to someone important. The new girl had been sent home at 10 after she dropped a tray of glasses and burst into tears. That left Grace as the closing server, the one who always stayed late to clean up, the one Vincent trusted, or at least trusted more than the others, to handle the money. If the cash disappeared tonight, Vincent would know exactly who took it, unless... Grace's eyes moved to the back door again. What if she made it look like a break-in? The lock on that door was ancient, barely functional. She could force it open from the outside, make it look like someone had jimmied their way in while she was in the bathroom or taking out the trash. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it might buy her enough time to disappear. Her hands moved before her conscious mind had fully committed to the decision. She grabbed an envelope from under the register, one of the large manila ones Vincent used for bank deposits, and started stuffing money inside. Her movements were quick, efficient, mechanical. She left exactly $300 in the tip jar, enough to make it look like a normal Friday night. The rest went into the envelope. $8,200. Grace sealed the envelope and shoved it into her oversized purse, an old canvas bag that had seen better days. Her heart was beating so fast she felt lightheaded. Was she really doing this? Was she actually about to steal from the mob? The word steal made her flinch, but she pushed the feeling away. This wasn't stealing. This was surviving. This was choosing herself for once instead of letting everyone else take and take and take until there was nothing left. She grabbed her jacket from the hook by the door, a thin denim thing that did almost nothing against the November rain but was all she had. The weight of the envelope in her purse felt like it might drag her down through the floor. "Vincent," she called out, moving toward the kitchen. "I'm going to take out the trash and then I'm heading out. You good to lock up?" There was a pause. Grace held her breath. "Yeah, whatever," Vincent finally answered. "You better be here on time tomorrow. We got a private party at 6. "I'll be here," Grace lied. She grabbed the bag of trash from behind the bar, might as well make it look legitimate, and headed for the back door. The kitchen was empty. Vincent had disappeared into the office, probably to count the register. Grace had maybe 5 minutes before he'd noticed the discrepancy in the tips. The back door opened with its usual groan of protest, revealing the alley behind the Blue Harbor. The rain had intensified, coming down in sheets that immediately soaked through Grace's jacket. The alley was narrow, barely wide enough for the dumpster and the delivery trucks that came every week. Puddles had formed in the uneven pavement, reflecting the distant streetlights like fragments of a broken mirror. Grace tossed the trash bag toward the dumpster. It missed, landing in a puddle, but she didn't care, and pulled her purse tighter against her body. The envelope inside felt like it was burning through the canvas, a beacon announcing her crime to anyone who looked. She started walking, heading toward the mouth of the alley where it opened onto Adams Street. Her apartment was to the left, a fourth-floor walk-up in a building that probably violated every housing code on the books. She needed to get there, grab her bag, and get to the bus station before Grace stopped. Someone was standing at the end of the alley. At first, she thought it might be a trick of the rain and the shadows, the way the streetlight created shapes that weren't really there. But then the figure moved, shifting its weight, and Grace's blood turned to ice. It was a man, tall, maybe 6'2" or 6'3", wearing a dark coat that gleamed wetly in the rain. He was just standing there, not moving toward her, not moving away. Just waiting. Grace's first instinct was to turn around, run back into the bar, lock the door behind her. But her feet wouldn't move. She was frozen, caught between the bar she was trying to escape and the unknown danger ahead. The man raised his hand, and for a heart-stopping moment, Grace thought he was reaching for a weapon. But instead, he brought something to his mouth. A small flame appeared, impossibly bright in the darkness, illuminating his face for just a second. A cigarette. He was lighting a cigarette. Grace's breath came in short, shallow gasps. The rain plastered her hair to her face, ran into her eyes, but she couldn't look away from the figure at the end of the alley. Every instinct she had was screaming at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. Behind her was Vincent and the bar. Ahead was this stranger, blocking her only exit. The man took a drag from his cigarette, the ember glowing red in the darkness. Then he spoke, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of the rain. "Hello, Grace." 2 words. That was all it took for Grace's entire world to collapse. He knew her name. "I think," the man continued, his tone conversational, almost friendly, "we need to have a conversation about what you've got in that bag." Grace's hand instinctively clutched her purse tighter. Her mind raced through possibilities, explanations, lies, anything that might get her out of this. But the words died in her throat, because as the man stepped forward, moving from shadow into the dim light cast by the bare bulb above the bar's back door, Grace finally saw his face clearly, and she knew exactly who he was. Everyone in Newark knew Damian Russo, even people who tried to stay away from that world, who kept their heads down and minded their business, knew his name and his face. He was in the newspapers sometimes, always in the background of charity events or restaurant openings, his presence lending an air of danger to otherwise respectable occasions. He was the ghost that haunted every conversation about the neighborhood, the unspoken name behind every locked door and every business that never quite seemed to make sense economically, but somehow thrived. He was 34 years old, and he'd been running the Russo family's operations for the last 6 years, since his father had a stroke and stepped back from active management. Under Damian's leadership, the family had consolidated power, absorbed smaller rivals, and transformed from old-school street thugs into something more sophisticated, more dangerous. And now he was standing in the alley behind the Blue Harbor, 10 feet away from Grace, smoking a cigarette and looking at her like he could see straight through her skin to the envelope of stolen money burning in her bag. "Mr. Russo," Grace heard herself say. Her voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. I was just taking out the trash," Damian finished for her. "Yes, I can see that." His eyes, dark, unreadable in the dim light, moved to the garbage bag lying in the puddle behind her. "Very thorough of you." He took another drag from his cigarette, never breaking eye contact. The rain didn't seem to bother him at all. His coat, expensive, Grace noticed now. Probably worth more than everything she owned. Shed water like it was nothing. Do you know why I'm here, Grace? She shook her head, not trusting her voice. Damien smiled. It wasn't a cruel smile exactly, but it wasn't warm either. It was the smile of someone who held all the cards and knew it. I'm here, he said slowly, because nothing happens in my establishments without my knowledge. And when something unusual happens, say, an exceptionally profitable night at a bar that usually barely breaks even, I pay attention. He flicked ash from his cigarette. And when one of the employees at that bar decides to leave through the back door with a suspiciously heavy purse, instead of the front entrance like usual, well, that gets my full attention. Grace felt the strength drain from her legs. She wanted to deny it, to lie, to do anything except stand there confirming his suspicions with her silence. But what was the point? He already knew, had probably known from the moment she'd made the decision. How long? She whispered. How long have you been watching? Long enough. Damien dropped his cigarette and crushed it under his heel. Then he took a step closer. Grace flinched but didn't back away. There was nowhere to go. Here's what's going to happen, he said, his voice still conversational but now edged with something harder. You're going to give me that envelope. Then you and I are going to have a conversation about your future. And depending on how that conversation goes, you might walk out of this alley. Or, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Grace's hand trembled as she reached into her purse. The envelope felt heavier than it had moments ago, weighted with all her hopes and all her stupidity. She pulled it out and held it toward him. Damien didn't take it immediately. Instead, he studied her face, his expression thoughtful. You're scared, he observed. That's smart. But you're not begging, not crying, not trying to run. He tilted his head slightly. Interesting. Would it matter if I did? Grace asked. The words came out sharper than she intended, but fear was crystallizing into something else now. Anger, maybe, or just the exhausted resignation of someone who had nothing left to lose. Damien's eyebrows rose slightly. Probably not, he admitted. He finally took the envelope, but instead of opening it, he slipped it into his coat pocket. Walk with me. What? Walk with me. He gestured toward the mouth of the alley. Unless you'd prefer to have this conversation here in the rain. Grace hesitated. Every survival instinct told her that getting into a car with Damien Russo, because surely that's where this was leading, was a death sentence. But staying here, running, fighting, none of those options ended well either. She started walking. They moved side by side down the alley, their footsteps splashing through puddles. Grace kept her arms wrapped around herself, trying to preserve some warmth against the cold rain. Damien walked like the weather didn't exist, his hands in his pockets, completely at ease. When they reached the street, Grace saw the car, a black Mercedes, sleek and expensive, parked illegally but unconcerned with such trivialities. A man stood beside it, broad-shouldered and alert, the driver presumably, but Damien didn't move toward the car. Instead, he turned to face Grace, his back to the Mercedes. Tell me about your brother, he said. Grace's blood turned to ice. What? Danny Monroe, 24 years old, diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia 18 months ago, currently receiving treatment at St. Francis Medical Center in Trenton. Damien recited the facts like he was reading from a file. The treatment is expensive, even with insurance, which I notice you barely have. The costs are considerable. You've been working double shifts here and picking up weekend work at the diner on Broad Street. You send every extra dollar to the medical center. Grace couldn't breathe. The casual way he laid out her entire life, the intimate knowledge of her most personal struggles. It was more terrifying than any threat he could have made. You're drowning in debt, Damien continued. Your credit cards are maxed out. You're 3 months behind on rent. Your landlord is threatening eviction. He paused. And tonight you saw a chance to fix everything. One envelope full of money and all your problems disappear. How do you... Grace started, but Damien cut her off with a raised hand. I know everything about everyone who works in my establishments, he said simply. It's good business. And you, Grace Monroe, have been on my radar for a while now. Why? The word came out as barely more than a whisper. Damien was quiet for a moment, studying her with those dark, calculating eyes. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost gentle. Because you're different from the others. You show up on time, you work hard, you don't complain. You handle difficult customers with grace, no pun intended. And you've never once asked Vincent for special treatment despite your circumstances. He tilted his head. You know what's most interesting? In 2 years of working at the Blue Harbor, you've never stolen a single dollar. Not until tonight. The observation hit Grace like a punch, because it was true. She'd had opportunities, plenty of them. Nights when Vincent was too intoxicated to count properly, when the register didn't balance, and no one would have noticed a 20 or a 50 disappearing. But she'd never done it. Some stubborn sense of integrity or maybe just fear had kept her honest. Until tonight. I was desperate, Grace said quietly. I know. Damien reached into his coat and pulled out the envelope. He turned it over in his hands, thoughtful. $8,200, that's what desperation looks like. He looked up at her. The question is, what do I do about it? Grace forced herself to meet his eyes. You could let me go. I could, Damien agreed. But we both know I won't. If I let you walk away with this money, word gets around. People start thinking I'm soft, that they can steal from me without consequences. Can't have that. Then what? Grace heard the defiance in her own voice and was surprised by it. You're going to hurt me? Make me disappear? Over $8,000? It's not about the money, Grace, it's about the principle. But even as he said it, Damien's expression suggested he was working through some calculation she couldn't follow. However, I'm not unreasonable. You made a desperate choice in a desperate situation. That I can understand. He held out the envelope. Grace stared at it, confused. I don't understand. Take it, Damien said. But know that this isn't charity. This is a loan. And like all loans, it comes with terms. What kind of terms? Damien's smile returned, and this time there was something almost amused in it. Starting Monday morning, you're going to work for me. Not as a waitress. I have enough of those. I need someone smart, someone I can trust with numbers and details. Someone who understands what discretion means. I'm not qualified for. You have 2 years of community college, Damien interrupted. Accounting major before you had to drop out. You're good with money, good with people, and most importantly, you're motivated. He gestured to the envelope. This covers your brother's treatment for the next 6 months. After that, we'll see how you're doing with your new position. Grace's mind reeled. This wasn't what she expected. Not punishment, not forgiveness, but something stranger. A transaction, a trap disguised as an opportunity. And if I say no, then I take the money back and you face the consequences of theft from a Russo family establishment. Damien's voice hardened. Vincent will want to make an example of you. I'll have to let him. And your brother. He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. Grace looked at the envelope in his hand, then at his face, trying to read the truth behind the offer. Was this real? Or was she trading one prison for another? But what choice did she have? Danny needed treatment. She needed to survive. And Damien Russo was offering both, wrapped in an envelope she'd tried to steal. She took the money. Damien nodded, satisfied. Smart choice. My driver will pick you up Monday morning, 7 a.m. sharp. He turned toward the Mercedes, then paused and looked back at her. One more thing, Grace. Don't make me regret this. I'm not usually this generous with people who try to rob me. I won't, Grace said, though she had no idea if that was true. Damien climbed into the back of the Mercedes. The driver closed the door behind him and moved to the driver's side. The engine purred to life, expensive and powerful like everything else in Damien Russo's world. As the car pulled away from the curb, Grace stood in the rain, clutching the envelope to her chest, wondering what exactly she'd just agreed to. The taillights of the Mercedes disappeared around the corner. The street was empty again, just rain and darkness and the distant hum of the city that never really slept. Grace looked down at the envelope in her hands. $8,200. Freedom, she'd thought just an hour ago. Now it felt like a chain. She turned and started walking toward her apartment, her mind already racing ahead to Monday morning, to whatever new life, or new cage, was waiting for her. Behind her, the Blue Harbor's sign flickered one more time and went dark. Grace didn't sleep that night. She sat on the edge of her mattress, a second-hand queen that sagged in the middle and smelled faintly of the previous owner's cigarette smoke, staring at the envelope on her nightstand. $8,200. She'd counted it 3 times after getting home, her hands shaking, half expecting the bills to dissolve into newspaper or Monopoly money, some cruel joke from a man who probably had dozens of ways to torment people who crossed him. But the money was real. Crisp hundreds and fifties, the kind that came fresh from a bank and not from the crumpled pockets of drunk customers at the Blue Harbor. Outside her window, Newark woke up slowly. Saturday morning traffic built gradually. The rumble of delivery trucks, the occasional siren, the rhythmic thump of bass from someone's car stereo. Grace's apartment was on the fourth floor of a building that had probably been elegant once, back in the 1920s when this neighborhood had money. Now the elevator hadn't worked in 6 months, the hallway always smelled like boiled cabbage and marijuana, and her neighbors included a rotating cast of characters she'd learned not to make eye contact with, but it was cheap, or it had been, before she fell behind on rent. Grace pulled out her phone, a cracked iPhone 8 she'd been nursing along for 3 years, and opened her banking app. The numbers on the screen were depressing but familiar. $247.32 in checking, $0. $0 in savings and 3 overdraft fees pending from earlier in the week when she'd tried to buy groceries and miscalculated her available balance. Her credit card accounts were worse. Maxed out, all of them, with minimum payments she could barely make. The debt had accumulated like sediment, layer upon layer. Danny's medical expenses that insurance refused to cover, her own emergency room visit last year when she'd collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration, the security deposit on this apartment, the cost of moving from Scranton after her mother died. 28 years old and drowning, Grace set the phone down and picked up the envelope again. This money could clear some of her credit cards, get her landlord off her back, keep Danny's treatment going. It was a life raft thrown to a drowning woman, but the rope attached to it led straight to Damian Russo. She thought about his face in the alley, the casual way he'd recited the details of her life like he was reading her diary. How long had he been watching? And more importantly, why? The question nagged at her through the long weekend. On Saturday, she called the care facility in Trenton where Danny was being treated. The administrator, a woman named Patricia who'd always been kind to Grace, confirmed that a payment had been made that morning. 6 months of treatment, fully covered. "It's a miracle," Patricia said warmly. "Your brother is so lucky to have a sister who works so hard for him." Grace had mumbled something non-committal and ended the call. Miracle. Right. She spent Saturday afternoon cleaning her apartment, a nervous energy driving her to scrub floors that hadn't been properly mopped in months. She washed dishes, organized her tiny closet, threw away expired food from her refrigerator, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from spiraling. On Sunday, she visited Danny. The care facility was a 90-minute bus ride from Newark, a journey Grace usually made once a week when she could afford the fare. She sat by the window watching New Jersey scroll past, industrial parks giving way to suburbs, then back to urban sprawl. The envelope was in her purse, making her hyper-aware of every other passenger, every person who might be watching her. Paranoia, she told herself. But after Friday night, paranoia seemed like common sense. Danny was in the common room when she arrived, playing chess with one of the nurses. He'd lost weight since the last time she'd visited, his cheekbones more prominent, his skin pale against the dark circles under his eyes. But he smiled when he saw her, that same crooked grin he'd had since he was a kid. "Grace, you came." He stood up too quickly and had to steady himself against the table. The nurse, a young guy named Marcus, helped him back into his chair. "Careful, Danny," Marcus said gently. "We talked about this." "I'm fine," Danny insisted, but his breathing was labored. He looked up at Grace with those big brown eyes that had always been able to get him out of trouble. "I'm fine, Gracie." "Really?" Grace bent down and hugged him, careful not to hold too tight. He felt fragile, like he might break. "Hey, little brother, how are you feeling?" "Better. The new medication is helping," they said. "Dr. Patel thinks—" He launched into an explanation of his latest treatment protocol, using medical terms he'd learned over the past 18 months of fighting this disease. Grace listened, nodding in the right places, trying not to think about what would happen if the money ran out. "But it won't," she reminded herself. "You have 6 months covered. And after that, she'd be working for Damian Russo." They spent 2 hours together. Grace didn't tell Danny about the new job, didn't mention anything about Friday night or the money or the man in the alley who'd turned her desperate theft into a binding contract. Instead, they talked about normal things. The book Danny was reading, the terrible food at the facility, memories of their childhood in Scranton before everything fell apart. When visiting hours ended, Danny hugged her tight. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything you do for me. I know it's hard." Grace's throat tightened. "You're my brother. It's not hard." The lie tasted bitter, but she smiled as she said it. On the bus ride back to Newark, Grace stared at her reflection in the window and wondered what she was becoming. A thief who got caught. A debtor who sold herself to pay what she owed. A sister who would do anything, absolutely anything, To keep her brother alive. Maybe all three. Monday morning arrived like a judge's gavel, final and unforgiving. Grace was awake at 5 a.m., though she'd barely slept. She stood in front of her closet, trying to decide what one wore to their first day working for the mob. Professional, casual. Should she try to look competent, or deliberately incompetent so they'd underestimate her? She settled on black pants, her only pair without visible wear, and a gray blouse she'd bought at Goodwill but looked almost new. Simple, neutral, forgettable. She pulled her dark hair into a ponytail and examined herself in the bathroom mirror. She looked tired, scared, young. At 6:50 a.m., Grace was standing on the sidewalk outside her building, her heart hammering against her ribs. The street was quiet, just the early morning sounds of the city waking up. A few cars passed, but none of them slowed. Maybe he forgot, she thought. Maybe the whole thing was some kind of test, and by showing up she'd passed, and now she could just go back to her regular life. A black Mercedes turned the corner. Grace recognized it immediately. The same car from Friday night, sleek and expensive and completely out of place on this rundown street. It pulled up to the curb in front of her, and the passenger window rolled down. The driver from Friday night looked at her. He was younger than she'd first thought, maybe early 30s, with a clean-shaven face and eyes that missed nothing. Grace Monroe? She nodded, not trusting her voice. Get in. Grace opened the back door and slid into leather seats that probably cost more than her monthly rent. The interior smelled like expensive cologne and new car. The driver pulled away from the curb before she'd even buckled her seatbelt. I'm Tony, the driver said, his eyes on the road. I'll be picking you up and dropping you off until Mr. Russo says otherwise. 7 a.m. sharp every day. Don't be late. Where are we going? Grace asked. Russo's. That told her exactly nothing, but Tony didn't seem inclined to elaborate. They drove in silence through Newark's morning traffic, heading toward the downtown area. Grace watched the city pass outside her window, trying to memorize the route in case she ever needed to. What? Escape? Run away? You already tried that, she reminded herself. Look how well it worked. After 20 minutes, Tony pulled up in front of a building Grace had passed 100 times but never really noticed. It was a restaurant, upscale with floor-to-ceiling windows and a tasteful sign that read Russo's in elegant script. Even at 7 in the morning, the place looked expensive. Front door, Tony said. Someone's waiting for you. Grace got out of the car and Tony drove off immediately, leaving her standing on the sidewalk. She took a deep breath, smoothed down her blouse, and walked to the entrance. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the restaurant was beautiful in that understated way that screamed money. Dark wood floors, white tablecloths, a bar along one wall with bottles that probably cost more than Grace made in a week. Everything was spotless, perfectly arranged, waiting for the evening service. You must be Grace. The voice came from near the bar. Grace turned and saw a woman in her 40s, impeccably dressed in a black pantsuit, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. She had the kind of face that was hard to read. Not unkind, but definitely not warm. I'm Angela Moretti, the woman said, walking toward Grace with measured steps. I manage the business operations here. Mr. Russo asked me to get you oriented. Moretti. Grace's mind made the connection immediately. Are you related to Vincent? Angela's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. My cousin, but we have very different roles in the organization. She looked Grace up and down, her assessment clinical. Follow me. We have a lot to cover before Mr. Russo arrives. Grace followed Angela through the restaurant to a door marked private that led to a hallway. They passed what looked like storage rooms, a commercial kitchen that was already being prepped by staff for the day, and finally arrived at a door at the end of the hall. Angela opened it to reveal an office that was nothing like Grace expected. It was professional, organized, almost corporate, with filing cabinets, a large desk with 2 computer monitors, and shelves lined with binders and ledgers. One wall had framed photographs. The restaurant at various stages of construction, what looked like a ribbon-cutting ceremony with local politicians, Damian Russo shaking hands with the mayor. This will be your workspace, Angela said. Your primary responsibility is maintaining accurate records of the restaurant's operations. Inventory, payroll, vendor payments, daily receipts. Everything needs to be documented, categorized, and reconciled. Grace stared at the desk, the computers, the filing system that looked more complex than anything she'd dealt with at the Blue Harbor. I don't understand. This is just restaurant management. This is a legitimate business, Angela said sharply. Russo's is a fully licensed, fully legal establishment. We serve excellent food to paying customers and operate within all applicable health codes and tax regulations. Is that clear? Yes, Grace said quickly, though she wasn't stupid. She knew what legitimate business meant in this context. It meant a front, a way to clean money that came from less legal sources. But Angela's defensive tone suggested that acknowledging that fact out loud would be a mistake. Angela spent the next hour walking Grace through the systems. There were spreadsheets for everything: food costs, labor percentages, profit margins. There were vendor contracts to review, invoices to process, payroll to calculate. It was overwhelming, detailed work that required attention and accuracy. It was also exactly the kind of work Grace had been training for before she'd dropped out of college. You'll start with basic data entry, Angela explained, pulling up a spreadsheet on one of the monitors. Every receipt from the restaurant gets entered here. Date, amount, payment method, server name. At the end of each week, the totals need to match the bank deposits exactly. What happens if they don't match? Grace asked. Angela looked at her with something that might have been respect. Then you find the discrepancy and fix it. Mr. Russo does not tolerate errors in his books. They worked through examples together, Angela showing Grace the systems while maintaining a professional distance that made it clear this wasn't a friendship. By 9 a.m., Grace's head was spinning with information, but she was starting to understand the scope of her new job. You'll work Monday through Friday 9 to 5, Angela said. Saturdays if we need you for special events. The pay is $1,500 a week, cash. Grace's head snapped up. $1,500, that's more than you were making at the Blue Harbor, Angela finished. Mr. Russo takes care of people who work for him, as long as they prove themselves valuable. $1,500 a week. That was $6,000 a month. More money than Grace had ever made in her life. Enough to not just survive, but to actually live, to pay off her debts, save money, maybe even. Don't get comfortable, Angela warned, reading her expression. This is a probationary period. If you make mistakes, if you talk to the wrong people, if you give Mr. Russo any reason to doubt your discretion. She didn't finish the sentence, but her meaning was clear. At 9:30, the office door opened without a knock. Damian Russo walked in like he owned the place, which Grace reminded herself he did. He was dressed differently than he'd been on Friday night, trading the rain-soaked coat for a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Grace's car had before it died last year. He looked every inch the successful restaurateur, the kind of man who appeared in lifestyle magazines and donated to local charities. He looked nothing like a crime boss, and somehow, that made him more dangerous. Angela, he said by way of greeting, then turned his attention to Grace. Ms. Monroe, how are we doing? She's a quick learner, Angela answered before Grace could speak. She understands the systems. Good. Damian moved to the desk and picked up one of the ledgers, flipping through it with the ease of someone who knew exactly what he was looking at. Grace, walk me through last Thursday's receipts. It was a test. Grace knew it immediately. She moved to the computer, pulled up the spreadsheet Angela had shown her, and started talking. Thursday's receipts broken down by meal service, lunch and dinner. Total revenue, $8,300. Credit card payments, $6,100. Cash, $2,200. She showed him how the numbers matched the bank deposit from Friday morning, how the inventory had been adjusted for the food used, how the labor costs were calculated based on hours worked. Damian listened without interrupting, his dark eyes fixed on the screen. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You missed something, he said finally. Grace's stomach dropped. She scanned the spreadsheet again, looking for her error. I don't see. Server tips. Damian pointed to a line item. They're not included in the revenue total, but they should be tracked separately for payroll tax purposes. He was right. Grace had completely overlooked that line. I'm sorry, don't apologize. Learn. Damian closed the ledger. Angela, show her how we handle tip reporting. I want her up to speed by the end of the week. Yes, sir. Damian started to leave, then paused at the door. Grace, my office. 2 minutes. He left before she could respond. Angela raised an eyebrow. That's either very good or very bad for you. His office is upstairs. Grace's hands were shaking as she climbed the narrow staircase at the back of the building. The second floor was quieter, carpeted, with artwork on the walls that looked original. At the end of the hallway was a door with a brass nameplate, D. Russo. She knocked. Come in. Damian's office was larger than the one downstairs, but just as organized. A massive desk dominated the space with leather chairs arranged for meetings. One wall was all windows overlooking the street below. Another wall had built-in bookshelves filled with titles on business management, Italian history, and classic literature. Damien was standing by the windows, looking down at the street. He didn't turn when Grace entered. "Close the door," he said. Grace did, her heart pounding. "Do you know why I hired you?" Damien asked, still facing the window. "Because I tried to steal from you," Grace said, deciding honesty was probably safer than lies. That made him turn around. A small smile played at the corner of his mouth. "Partially, but that's not the whole reason." He moved to his desk and leaned against it, crossing his arms. "I've had dozens of employees steal from me over the years. Most of them I deal with through Vincent or Tony. They disappear from payroll, and that's the end of it." Grace swallowed hard. "Why was I different?" "Because you were smart about it. You waited 2 years. You never took small amounts that might go unnoticed. You went all in when you saw a real opportunity. And when I caught you, you didn't collapse into tears or try to seduce your way out of trouble." His eyes locked on hers. "You stood there in the rain and accepted the consequences. That takes guts. Or stupidity," Grace muttered. Damien's smile widened. "Sometimes they're the same thing." He pushed off from the desk and walked closer to her. "I'm going to be honest with you, Grace. This restaurant is successful, but it's not my primary business. I have other operations, some legal, some less so, that require careful financial management. I need people I can trust to handle sensitive information without asking too many questions." "And you think I'm trustworthy?" Grace couldn't keep the disbelief out of her voice. "I literally tried to rob you 3 days ago." "You tried to save your brother," Damien corrected. "There's a difference. Desperation makes people do things they wouldn't normally do. I understand that. What matters is what you do next." He studied her carefully. "Angela will teach you the restaurant business. If you're as good with numbers as I think you are, you'll move into other areas of my operation. But that's dependent on you proving yourself." "What if I can't?" Grace asked quietly. "What if I'm not good enough? Then we'll have a different conversation," Damien said. His tone was pleasant, but the implication was clear. "But I don't think that's going to happen. You want to know why?" Grace nodded. "Because you have everything to lose and everything to gain. That's the perfect motivation." He returned to his desk and sat down, clearly dismissing her. "Get back to work. And Grace, don't make me regret this." Grace left his office feeling like she'd just survived an interrogation. Her legs were weak as she descended the stairs, and she had to pause halfway down to catch her breath. What had she gotten herself into? The first week passed in a blur of numbers, spreadsheets, and Angela's crisp instructions. Grace arrived every morning at 7 sharp, spent 9 hours learning systems that were far more complex than anything at the Blue Harbor, and went home each night with her brain feeling like it had been wrung out and hung up to dry. But she was good at it, better than good. By Wednesday, she was catching errors in the previous month's reconciliations, small discrepancies that added up to significant amounts. By Friday, she'd reorganized the filing system in a way that made Angela nod approvingly, which felt like high praise from a woman who seemed incapable of actual compliments. The restaurant itself was fascinating. During the day, Grace worked upstairs while the kitchen staff prepped for evening service. But sometimes she'd come down to file something or ask Angela a question, and she'd see the controlled chaos of a professional kitchen in action. The head chef, a temperamental man named Marco, who'd apparently trained in Italy, ruled his domain with shouted orders and impossible standards. The evening crowd was different from the Blue Harbor's clientele. These were people with money, businessmen celebrating deals, couples on anniversary dinners, local politicians who wanted to be seen at Russo's. The service was impeccable, the food was apparently excellent. Grace had never actually eaten there, and the atmosphere was sophisticated without being pretentious. It was, Grace had to admit, actually a well-run restaurant. But she wasn't naive. She saw the men who came in through the back entrance, who met with Damien in his office and left carrying briefcases or envelopes. She noticed how certain tables were always reserved, always given the best service, always comped their meals. She understood that the restaurant's impressive revenue didn't quite match the expensive build-out and premium location without some additional income stream. She didn't ask questions. That was the first rule Angela had made clear. See everything. Say nothing. On Friday afternoon, Grace was reconciling the week's credit card receipts when Vincent walked into the office. She'd been half expecting this confrontation all week, but Vincent's actual presence still made her stomach clench. He looked the same as he always had. Stocky build, thinning hair slicked back, the kind of face that defaulted to a scowl. He was wearing a leather jacket despite the warm office, and he smelled like cigarettes and cologne. "Well, well," Vincent said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Look who got promoted." Grace kept her eyes on her screen, determined not to show fear. "Vincent, it's Mr. Moretti now," he said, moving closer to her desk. "Since we're being all professional." Angela appeared in the doorway, her expression neutral but her presence clearly intentional. "Vincent, if you need something, you can make an appointment." "Just saying hello to our new employee," Vincent said, but his eyes never left Grace. "Making sure she understands how things work around here." "She understands," Angela said firmly. "And she's busy, unless you have actual business." "I'm going," Vincent interrupted. He leaned down, bringing his face close to Grace's. His breath smelled like coffee and cigarettes. "You got lucky, Princess. Don't think for a second that means you're special. One mistake, and you're done." He straightened up and left without waiting for a response. Grace's hands were shaking. She forced herself to take a deep breath, to focus on the numbers on the screen, to not let Vincent see how much he'd rattled her. "He's threatened by you," Angela said quietly, once Vincent's footsteps had faded down the hallway. Grace looked up surprised. "Why would he be threatened by me? I'm just doing data entry." Angela's smile was thin. "Because Vincent has been stealing from Mr. Russo for months, and he knows that someone who's actually good with numbers will eventually notice." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to detonate. Grace's mouth went dry. "I don't understand." "Yes, you do." Angela moved to the door and closed it. When she turned back, her expression was serious. "You're smart, Grace. Smart enough to know that I'm not telling you this casually. Mr. Russo asked me to see how long it would take you to notice the discrepancies." "This is a test," Grace said slowly. "Everything is a test." Angela sat down in the chair across from Grace's desk. "Vincent has been skimming from the Blue Harbor's receipts for the past 8 months. Small amounts, carefully hidden in the books. He thought he was being clever." "How much?" Grace asked, though part of her didn't want to know. "Approximately $4,000 a month. He's using the money to pay off gambling debts to some very unpleasant people." Angela's eyes were hard. "Mr. Russo has known for 3 weeks. He's been waiting to see if anyone else would notice." Grace's mind raced. She thought about Vincent's behavior at the Blue Harbor, his mood swings, the way he'd sometimes disappear for hours during shifts. She thought about the cash discrepancies she'd sometimes noticed but never questioned, because she'd assumed it was normal, that she was too new to understand how things worked. "What happens to him?" she asked. "That depends on Mr. Russo, and potentially, on you, on me." Angela stood up. "Go through the Blue Harbor's books from the past year. The files are in the bottom drawer of that cabinet. Document every discrepancy you find. Be thorough, be accurate, and have a report ready by Monday morning." "And then what?" "Then you'll present your findings to Mr. Russo, and he'll decide what to do with Vincent." Angela moved to the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, Grace, you're doing well, better than I expected. Just remember, in this business, loyalty is everything. Once you show Mr. Russo where Vincent's been stealing from him, you're all in. There's no going back to being an innocent bystander." She left, closing the door softly behind her. Grace sat alone in the office, staring at the filing cabinet Angela had indicated. Inside were the answers that would seal Vincent's fate. Inside was proof that would tie Grace even more tightly to Damian Russo's operation. Inside was the point of no return. She thought about Danny, about the treatment that was keeping him alive. She thought about the $1,500 a week that had already started to ease the crushing weight of her debts. She thought about the alternative, going back to the Blue Harbor, to poverty, to watching her brother die because she couldn't afford to save him. Grace pulled open the bottom drawer and extracted the first ledger. The numbers told their own story. Vincent had been clever, never taking from the same revenue stream 2 days in a row, varying the amounts, hiding the theft in legitimate-looking categories like breakage or comps. But he'd made mistakes, small inconsistencies that added up once Grace started looking for patterns. She worked through the weekend, barely sleeping, surviving on coffee and takeout she charged to the company card Angela had given her. The office was quiet on Saturday and Sunday, just Grace and the occasional security guard who checked on her with polite nods. By Sunday evening, she had everything documented: dates, amounts, methods. 47 separate incidents of theft, totaling just over $48,000. Vincent had stolen $48,000 from Damian Russo. and Grace had just documented every penny of it. Monday morning arrived with unseasonable cold. Grace dressed carefully, the same black pants and gray blouse, armor against whatever was coming. Tony picked her up at 7 sharp, and the drive to Russo's felt like riding toward an execution. Her execution or Vincent's? Grace wasn't entirely sure which. Angela was waiting in the office when Grace arrived. "Do you have it?" Grace handed over the folder containing her findings. 30 pages of documentation, spreadsheets, highlighted discrepancies, and a summary report that laid out Vincent's theft in damning detail. Angela flipped through it, her expression unreadable. "This is good work, very thorough. What happens now?" Grace asked. "Now you present this to Mr. Russo. He's expecting you at 8:30. Angela checked her watch. "You have 40 minutes. I suggest you practice what you're going to say." Grace spent those 40 minutes in a state of barely controlled panic. She reviewed her findings, rehearsed her presentation, tried to anticipate questions. At 8:25, Angela appeared in the doorway. "He's ready for you." The walk upstairs felt like climbing a scaffold. Grace's hands were sweating as she knocked on Damien's office door. "Come in." Damien was at his desk reading something on his computer. He gestured to the chair across from him without looking up. "Sit. Give me a minute." Grace sat, clutching her folder, waiting. Finally, Damien looked up. "I understand you have something for me." "Yes, sir." Grace's voice was steadier than she felt. She opened the folder and began her presentation, walking him through Vincent's theft systematically. She explained the patterns, showed him the documentation, presented the total with clinical precision. Damien listened without interrupting. His expression gave nothing away. Not anger, not surprise, not satisfaction. When Grace finished, he held out his hand for the folder. She gave it to him. He spent 5 minutes reviewing her work, flipping through pages, checking calculations. Grace barely breathed. "This is excellent work," Damien said finally. He closed the folder and set it aside. "You found everything I expected you to find, and you did it faster than Angela predicted." "You already knew," Grace said. "It wasn't a question. I told you. Nothing happens in my establishments without my knowledge. Vincent started stealing from me 8 months ago. I've been documenting it, waiting for the right moment to address it." "Then why did you need me to find it?" Damien leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Because I needed to know if you were thorough enough to catch someone smarter than Vincent. Because I needed to see if you'd try to protect him out of some misguided loyalty to your old workplace. And because I needed you to understand exactly what kind of business you're part of now." Grace's mouth was dry. "What's going to happen to him? That's not your concern. He's Angela's cousin." "Angela understands how this works," Damien interrupted. "Family doesn't get special treatment in business. If anything, the standards are higher." He stood up and moved to the windows, his back to Grace. "Vincent made a choice. He stole from me, used my money to pay debts to people who disrespect me and my organization. There are consequences for that. Are you going to—" Grace stopped, not sure how to finish the question. Damien turned to face her. "Am I going to hurt him?" "No. I'm not a monster, Grace, despite what you might think. Vincent will be removed from my employment. His gambling debts will be settled through other means, and he'll leave Newark. That's more mercy than he deserves. Because of Angela? Because of the value his family has provided over the years. But his protection only extends so far. If he ever comes back to this city, if he ever speaks about my business to anyone, the outcome will be different." Damien's eyes were hard. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "Yes," Grace whispered. "Good. Because the same rules apply to you. You're part of this now. You've proven you're valuable, and I'll protect you and provide for you as long as you remain loyal. But betray me, steal from me, speak to the wrong people." He left the threat unfinished. "Are we clear?" "We're clear." Damien's expression softened slightly. "Don't look so terrified. You did exactly what I asked. You should be proud. This kind of analytical work is rare. Angela speaks highly of your abilities." "Thank you," Grace said because she didn't know what else to say. "Starting next week, you'll take on additional responsibilities. I have other ventures that need the kind of attention to detail you've demonstrated. The pay will increase accordingly." "Additional responsibilities," Grace repeated carefully. "Meaning?" "Meaning you'll be handling books for more than just the restaurant. My construction company, my consulting firm, my investments." Damien returned to his desk and sat down. "All legitimate businesses, all requiring accurate financial management. All fronts for money laundering," Grace's brain supplied, but she kept her expression neutral. "You'll need to be available some evenings and occasional weekends. Damien continued. Tony will drive you where you need to be. Angela will introduce you to the other managers. And Grace? He looked at her directly. This promotion comes with a raise to $3,000 a week. Grace's heart stopped. $3,000? You're worth it. Don't make me regret believing that. She left his office in a daze. $3,000 a week. That was $156,000 a year. That was more money than she'd ever imagined making. That was a life she'd never thought possible. That was a deal with the devil, and she'd just signed in blood. Angela was waiting in the hallway. How did it go? He promoted me, Grace said, still processing. I told him you were ready. Angela started walking toward the stairs. Come on, we have a lot of work to do. And Grace, welcome to the family. The word family sent a chill down Grace's spine. She'd escaped the Blue Harbor, escaped Vincent's cruelty and her dead-end life. She'd secured Danny's treatment, climbed out of debt, found financial stability. But as she followed Angela down the stairs, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that she'd traded one cage for another. This one was gilded, comfortable, well compensated, but it was still a cage. And Damien Russo held the only key. 3 months passed like a fever dream. Grace's new life had a rhythm she was still learning to navigate. Monday through Friday at Russo's, evenings reviewing books for Damien's other businesses, a construction company in Elizabeth, a consulting firm in Hoboken, commercial properties scattered across northern New Jersey. The work was challenging, complex, exactly what she'd once dreamed of doing with her accounting degree. Except every number told a story she wasn't supposed to acknowledge. She'd gotten good at seeing without seeing, the construction contracts that paid too much, the consulting fees that didn't match the services provided, the cash deposits that appeared and disappeared like ghosts in the ledgers. Grace reconciled the numbers, balanced the books, and asked no questions. Danny's treatments were going well. Her debts were paid. She'd moved to a better apartment in a safer neighborhood. She sent money to causes her mother would have supported. On paper, her life had transformed, but she couldn't shake the feeling of invisible walls closing in. Grace, can you explain this? Damien's voice pulled her from her thoughts. It was late Thursday evening and she was in his office reviewing quarterly reports. He was pointing to a line item in the construction company's expenses. She leaned closer, studying the numbers. Her stomach dropped. That doesn't match the vendor invoice, she said slowly. Someone adjusted the payment after it cleared. How much? Grace pulled up the original invoice on her laptop. $12,000. The invoice was for $48,000, but $56,000 was paid out. Damien's expression darkened. Who authorized it? Grace checked the approval signature. Her blood ran cold. Vincent. The name hung between them like a curse. Vincent, who was supposed to be gone. Vincent, who'd been fired 3 months ago but apparently still had access to certain accounts. He was supposed to be out of the system, Grace said quietly. He was. Damien pulled out his phone and made a call. Tony, find Vincent Moretti, now. He ended the call and looked at Grace. How long has this been going on? Grace's fingers flew across the keyboard, searching for other anomalies. At least 2 months, maybe longer. He's been careful, spacing out the theft, using different vendor accounts. How much total? She calculated quickly, her heart racing. Approximately $68,000. Damien stood abruptly, his controlled demeanor cracking for the first time since Grace had known him. $68,000. After I gave him a chance to disappear quietly. What are you going to do? Grace asked, though she feared the answer. Damien's eyes met hers, and what she saw there made her understand exactly how dangerous he truly was. What I should have done 3 months ago. And Grace? His voice was ice. You just signed his death warrant. Are you prepared for what comes next? Grace didn't sleep that night. She sat in her new apartment, a 1-bedroom in a renovated building in the Ironbound district, with working heat and windows that actually locked, staring at her phone. Damien's words echoed in her mind on an endless loop. You just signed his death warrant. She'd tried to convince herself it was hyperbole, a figure of speech, but the look in Damien's eyes had been cold, final. This wasn't a man who made empty threats. At 3 a.m. her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Tony will pick you up at 6 a.m., dress professionally. Dr. Grace's hands trembled as she typed back. Where are we going? The response came immediately. To finish what you started. She spent the next 3 hours in a fog of anxiety and guilt. Vincent was a terrible person. He'd been cruel to her, stolen from Damien, betrayed every chance he'd been given. But did that mean he deserved whatever Damien had planned? Grace thought about calling the police. But what would she say? That her mob boss employer was angry at someone for embezzling? That she'd helped document the theft? She'd incriminate herself, destroy any chance of protecting Danny, and probably end up in worse danger than Vincent. At 5:30 a.m., she dressed in the same black pants and gray blouse that had become her uniform. Professional, unremarkable, the clothes of someone trying to disappear into the background. Tony arrived exactly at 6. The drive was silent, tense. They headed east toward the industrial waterfront where shipping containers and warehouses created a maze of rust and concrete. Grace's stomach churned with every mile. They pulled up to a warehouse that looked abandoned. Broken windows, graffiti-covered walls, weeds growing through cracks in the pavement. But when Tony led her inside, Grace found the interior was anything but empty. The space had been converted into what looked like a legitimate business office. There were desks, filing cabinets, computers, a conference room with glass walls, and in that conference room sat Vincent Moretti, flanked by 2 large men Grace didn't recognize. Damien was standing by the windows, his back to the door. He turned when Grace entered. "Thank you for coming," he said, as if she'd had a choice. "What is this?" Grace asked quietly. "This is a conversation about consequences." Damien gestured to the conference room. "Come." Grace followed him, her legs feeling like they might give out. Through the glass she could see Vincent's face, pale, sweating, terrified. His eyes locked on Grace with a mixture of hatred and desperation. Inside the conference room, Damien took the seat at the head of the table. "Sit," he told Grace, indicating the chair beside him. She sat, acutely aware of Vincent across from her, and the 2 enforcers standing behind him like silent sentinels. "Vincent," Damien began, his tone conversational. "Grace discovered something interesting in the construction company's books. Would you like to explain?" Vincent's jaw clenched. "I don't know what you're talking about." Damien slid a folder across the table. "Grace's documentation of the theft. $68,000 over 2 months. After I gave you a second chance. After I let you leave quietly." His voice remained calm, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "You disrespected me, Vincent. You made me look weak. I had debts. We all have debts." Damien's hand slammed on the table, making Grace jump. It was the first time she'd seen him lose his composure. "I gave you a way out. I protected you from your own stupidity. And you repaid me by stealing more?" Vincent's face crumbled. "Please, Damien, I can pay it back. I just need time." "Time is something you no longer have." Damien stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "You're going to tell me who you've been working with, who helped you access those accounts after you were terminated." "I did it alone," Vincent said quickly. Too quickly. Damien looked at Grace. "Is that possible?" Grace pulled up the audit trail on her laptop, which Tony had brought in. "No. The passwords were changed after Vincent was fired. Someone with current system access would have needed to help him." "Who?" Damien asked Vincent. Vincent's silence was answer enough. Damien nodded to one of the enforcers, who stepped forward. Vincent flinched, but the man simply placed a folder in front of him. "These are transfer papers," Damien said. "You're going to sign over your ownership stake in the Blue Harbor to Angela. You're going to provide written testimony about your gambling associates. And you're going to tell me who else in my organization is working against me. And if I don't?" Vincent's voice cracked. "Then this conversation becomes much less pleasant." Damien's tone made it clear this wasn't a negotiation. Vincent's hands shook as he opened the folder. Grace watched, feeling sick, as he read through the documents. His entire livelihood, his only asset, being stripped away. "The Blue Harbor was my father's," Vincent whispered. "Your father would be ashamed of what you've become," Damien said coldly. "Sign." Vincent picked up the pen. For a moment Grace thought he might refuse, might do something stupid. But survival instinct won. He signed. "Now," Damien said. The name. Vincent's eyes shifted to Grace, filled with venom. Her. Grace's blood turned to ice. "What? You think you're so smart?" Vincent spat. "Miss Perfect coming in and taking my job. I wasn't working alone. She helped me. Gave me the access codes, told me when the audits were happening." "That's a lie," Grace said, standing abruptly. "I never—" "Sit down," Damien ordered, his voice cutting through her protest. To Vincent, "You're accusing Grace of helping you steal from me? The same woman who exposed your theft in the first place?" "It's a setup." Vincent was getting desperate now. "She wanted my position. She documented just enough to make herself look good while hiding her own involvement." "Enough." Damien's voice was quiet, which somehow made it more terrifying. He looked at Grace. Can you prove you weren't involved? Grace's mind raced. The audit trail shows every login, every access point. My credentials were never used to make those payments. Check the timestamps. Most of Vincent's theft happened on nights I wasn't even working. Damien nodded to one of his men, who left the room, presumably to verify her claim. The wait was agonizing. Vincent sat slumped in his chair, his bluff called. Grace stood rigid, knowing that her entire future hung on digital timestamps and login credentials. After 10 minutes that felt like hours, the enforcer returned and whispered something to Damien. Damien's expression didn't change, but Grace saw something shift in his eyes. Grace's credentials were never used. The access came from Angelo Ricci's account. Vincent's face went ashen. Angelo, Damien said slowly, is my logistics manager, and your gambling buddy. He leaned forward. You involved one of my trusted people in your scheme. You compromised my operation, put my business at risk, and then tried to frame an innocent employee to save yourself. I'm sorry, Vincent choked out. Please, I'm sorry. You're pathetic. Damien straightened. Here's what's going to happen. You're leaving Newark today. You'll relocate to wherever I tell you to go. You'll work whatever job I arrange, and 50% of your income will go toward paying back what you stole. If you ever return to New Jersey, if you contact anyone in my organization, if you even think about betraying me again. He leaned down until his face was inches from Vincent's. There won't be a conversation. There won't be a warning. Do you understand? Vincent nodded, tears streaming down his face. Get him out of my sight, Damien said to his men. They hauled Vincent out of the conference room. Grace watched him go, feeling a complex mixture of relief and pity. He'd been cruel to her, had tried to destroy her to save himself, but she'd also just witnessed a man's complete destruction. When they were alone, Damien turned to Grace. Are you all right? He tried to blame me, Grace said, her voice shaking with anger and residual fear. He looked you in the eye and lied, and I knew he was lying. Damien's expression softened slightly. I've been in this business long enough to know when someone's desperate. Vincent was grasping at straws. But what if the timestamps had been different? What if there wasn't proof? There's always proof if you know where to look. Damien moved to the windows, looking out at the warehouse district. The question is whether you know how to read it. Grace sat down heavily. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving her exhausted. What about Angelo? He'll be dealt with. Damien's tone made it clear that conversation was over. You did well today, Grace. Staying calm, providing evidence instead of emotional arguments. That's valuable. I didn't do anything except tell the truth. In this business, that's rarer than you think. Damien checked his watch. It's early still. Tony will take you home. Take the day off. Grace stood, but hesitated at the door. Mr. Russo, can I ask you something? Damien, you've earned first-name basis. Damien, the name felt strange on her tongue. Why did you really hire me? And please don't say it was just because I tried to steal from you. Damien was quiet for a long moment. Do you know what I saw that night in the alley, Grace? I saw someone who'd reached the end of their rope and made a desperate choice. But I also saw someone who, when caught, didn't collapse or beg or try to manipulate their way out. You stood there and accepted the consequences. He turned to face her. That kind of integrity is rare, especially in people desperate enough to steal. I wanted to see if that integrity was real or just shock. And it's real. You could have participated in Vincent's scheme. He would have cut you in, given you money to stay quiet. But you didn't. You did your job, found the theft, reported it, even knowing what it might mean for him. Damien's eyes met hers. That's the kind of person I want working for me. Grace absorbed this. I'm not a good person, she said quietly. I stole from you. I'm helping you launder money. I'm not stupid. I know what this business really is. I'm complicit in things I never thought I'd be part of. None of us are purely good or purely evil, Grace. We're all just trying to survive in the circumstances we find ourselves in. Damien crossed his arms. You had a choice between letting your brother die or compromising your principles. You chose your brother. That doesn't make you evil, it makes you human. Is that how you justify it? Grace asked, then immediately regretted the boldness. But Damien didn't seem offended. Every day. My father built this organization through violence and fear. I'm trying to transform it into something more sustainable. Legitimate businesses, political connections, economic power instead of physical intimidation. But that transformation takes time and money and people I can trust. He paused. I'm not asking you to approve of everything I do, Grace. I'm asking you to do your job well and be loyal. The rest is between you and your conscience. Grace thought about that as Tony drove her home. Her conscience. What did it even say anymore? She'd crossed lines she never thought she'd cross. She'd become part of an organization she'd once feared. She'd helped bring down Vincent. A terrible person, yes, but still a human being who was now exiled and broken. And yet, Danny was alive and getting better. The doctors were talking about remission, about hope. Grace had financial stability for the first time in her adult life. She was using skills she'd thought would waste away in dead-end jobs. She was, in a strange way, valued. Was that worth the compromise? The next 2 weeks were relatively quiet. Vincent disappeared. Grace heard through Angela that he'd been relocated to Arizona and was working in construction management, his wages garnished to repay his debt. Angelo had also vanished from the organization, his fate unspoken but understood. Grace threw herself into work. She reorganized the entire financial system across Damien's businesses, implemented new security protocols, created audit trails that would make future theft nearly impossible. Angela watched her with growing approval. "You're wasted on bookkeeping," Angela said one afternoon. "You should be running operations." "I'm fine where I am," Grace said quickly. "No one's ever fine anywhere in this business. You're either climbing or you're falling." Angela leaned against Grace's desk. "Damien's planning to expand. He's looking at investments in Atlantic City, maybe Philadelphia. He'll need someone he trusts to manage the finances." "That sounds like a lot of responsibility. That sounds like opportunity." Angela studied her. "You still think you're temporary, don't you? Like this is just a job you're doing until something better comes along?" Grace didn't answer. "There is nothing better, Grace. Not for people like us. We don't get fairy tale endings or easy escapes. We get survival. We get stability. We get to protect the people we love." Angela's expression softened. "Danny's doing well, I hear. How do you—" "We keep track of our people's families. It's not surveillance, it's care. Making sure the people who matter to our employees are safe and cared for." Angela straightened. "Damien's not a monster, despite what the newspapers say. He takes care of his own." After Angela left, Grace sat thinking about that word, own, as in Damien's people, his property, his responsibility. She'd become one of his own without quite realizing it. That evening, Grace visited Danny. He was doing remarkably better, color in his cheeks, energy in his voice. The doctors were cautiously optimistic about his prognosis. "You look stressed," Danny observed as they played cards in the common room. "Work okay?" "Work's fine, just busy." "The new job still going well?" "You never really told me what you're doing." Grace had kept it vague, told Danny she'd gotten hired as a financial administrator for a restaurant group. Not technically a lie, just incomplete. "It's good. Challenging but good. The pay is much better." Danny grinned. "Good enough to stop stealing my winning poker hands?" Grace laughed, the tension easing slightly. This, her brother's smile, his improving health, the future they might actually have together. This was why she'd made the choices she'd made. On the bus ride back to Newark, Grace's phone rang. "Damien, can you come to the restaurant? Something's come up." 20 minutes later, Grace was back in Damien's office. He was on the phone when she arrived, speaking in rapid Italian to someone who seemed to be frustrating him. He gestured for her to sit. When he finally ended the call, he looked tired, more human than she'd ever seen him. "Problem?" Grace asked. "Always." He poured himself a drink from the bar cart, whiskey neat, and offered one to Grace. She declined. "I have a proposition for you." "Another one?" Damien smiled slightly. "This one's different. I'm opening a new venture, a consulting firm that advises legitimate businesses on expansion, acquisitions, financial strategy, completely legal, potentially very profitable." "Potentially," Grace repeated. "It will also serve as a clearinghouse for certain other transactions. But the core business will be legitimate and I want you to run it." Grace stared at him. "Run it? I'm 28 years old with 2 years of incomplete college education, and 3 months of proving you're smarter and more capable than people with MBAs and decades of experience." Damien set down his drink. "I need someone who understands numbers, who can talk to legitimate business people without setting off alarms, and who I can trust absolutely. That's you." "Why would legitimate businesses work with a consulting firm run by someone connected to you?" "Because they won't know you're connected to me. The firm will be in your name, your face on the contracts. I'll be a silent partner, providing capital and connections. You'll build the actual business." Grace's mind raced with the implications. This is huge." "Yes, It's also your chance to build something real, something you can be proud of, that your brother can be proud of. Damien leaned forward. I'm not going to pretend this is pure altruism. Having a legitimate consulting firm run by someone with your intelligence and integrity is valuable to me, but it's also an opportunity for you to step into a role that's more than just bookkeeping. What about the certain other transactions? Will be kept completely separate from the legitimate business. Firewalls, separate accounts, different personnel. If you build the consulting firm successfully, the other side should never touch your work. Should never, Grace repeated. Nothing in life is guaranteed, Grace. You know that better than most. Damien stood and moved to the windows. I'm giving you a choice. You can continue as you are, doing excellent work, earning good money, staying in the shadows. Or you can step into the light, build something significant, and take control of your own future within this organization. What if I say I want out entirely? Grace heard herself ask. What if I take what I've saved, get Danny settled, and disappear? Damien turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Then you'd be free to go. Grace's heart stopped. Really? Really? I told you from the beginning. I value loyalty, but I don't keep slaves. If you want to walk away, if you've decided this life isn't for you, I won't stop you. He paused. But you should know that the protection I provide, the financial support for Danny's ongoing treatment, the security of knowing that people won't come after you for perceived debts or old grudges, all of that goes with you. There it was. Not a threat, exactly. Just a statement of reality. She could leave, but she'd leave alone, unprotected, back to the life of desperation she'd been living before. That's not really a choice, Grace said quietly. It's the only choice any of us have. We decide what we're willing to sacrifice for the people we love and the life we want to live. Damien returned to his desk. I'm offering you partnership, Grace. Real opportunity, but only if you want it. Grace sat in silence, weighing her options. She thought about Danny, about the apartment she could afford, about the skills she'd developed. She thought about the line she'd already crossed and the person she was becoming. She thought about freedom and what it really meant. Can I have some time to think about it? She asked finally. You have until Monday. The papers will be ready either way. Damien's phone buzzed and he glanced at it. Tony will take you home. Grace spent the weekend wrestling with her decision. She made lists of pros and cons. She researched business consulting firms, read articles about entrepreneurship, tried to imagine herself in that role. She also researched ways out, how to disappear, how to relocate with a sick family member, how to start over in a new city. But every scenario that didn't include Damien's protection ended with Danny's treatment being interrupted, with Grace struggling to find work that paid enough, with the slow slide back into poverty and desperation. On Sunday evening, she sat in her apartment with a glass of wine, a luxury she'd never been able to afford before, and acknowledged the truth she'd been avoiding. She didn't want out. The realization was startling. Somewhere along the way, she'd stopped seeing this as a temporary situation and started seeing it as her life. Not the life she'd planned, not the life she'd once dreamed of, but a life that was hers, that she was building with her own choices and her own compromises. She'd crossed the threshold. There was no going back to the innocent waitress who'd tried to steal $8,000 in a moment of desperation. That woman was gone. The woman who remained was stronger, smarter, more capable, and yes, more compromised, but also more in control of her destiny than she'd ever been. On Monday morning, Grace arrived at Russo's at 7 sharp. She went straight to Damien's office where he was already working. I have your answer, she said. Damien looked up from his computer. And? I want to do it. Run the consulting firm. Build something real. Grace sat down across from him. But I have conditions. Damien's eyebrows rose. Conditions? Danny never knows about the other side of your business. He believes I run a legitimate consulting firm, nothing more. If anything ever happens to me, his treatment continues regardless. Agreed. I want final say over which clients we take on. If I think someone or some business is going to damage our legitimate reputation, I can refuse the contract. Within reason, agreed. And I want it in writing that after 5 years, I can buy you out. The firm becomes fully mine. Our partnership dissolves and I walk away clean. Damien studied her for a long moment. You're planning your exit before you even begin. I'm planning my future. There's a difference. Grace met his eyes steadily. You said you valued integrity. This is mine. I'm willing to work with you, build something valuable together, but I'm not willing to belong to anyone forever. Not even you. A slow smile spread across Damien's face. Now that's interesting. Everyone else who works for me is looking for lifetime security. You're negotiating an end date. Is that a problem? On the contrary, it shows you're thinking strategically, not just reactively. He pulled out a folder and slid it across the desk. These are the partnership documents. I'll have my lawyer add your conditions. Anything else? Grace thought for a moment. One more thing. I want to learn everything. Not just the books and the numbers. I want to understand how all of this works. The legitimate businesses, the connections, the political relationships. If I'm going to represent your interests, I need to understand the full picture. Knowledge can be dangerous, Grace. More dangerous than ignorance? She shook her head. I'm already in this. I'd rather understand what I'm part of than stumble around blind. Damien considered this, then nodded. Fair enough. Angela will expand your training. But understand, once you know certain things, there really is no going back. I understand. Damien extended his hand across the desk. Then we have a deal. Welcome to partnership, Grace Monroe. Grace shook his hand, feeling the weight of the moment. This was it. The final step from victim to participant, from pawn to player. As she left his office, Grace caught her reflection in the window. She looked different than she had 4 months ago. More polished, more confident, more herself somehow, despite, or maybe because of, the compromises she'd made. She'd started this journey trying to steal money for freedom. She'd ended it by choosing a different kind of freedom. The freedom that came from agency, from power, from understanding the rules of the game and learning to play it well. 6 months later, Monroe Consulting Group opened its doors in a renovated office building in downtown Newark. Grace hired 3 employees, all legitimate business consultants with real credentials. The firm took on its first clients, small businesses looking to expand, entrepreneurs seeking guidance, companies navigating complex acquisitions. The work was challenging and rewarding. Grace discovered she was good at it, not just the numbers, but the strategy, the relationship building, the problem solving. And yes, there was the other side, the occasional client who came through Damien's connections, whose business needed to be managed carefully, whose transactions required particular discretion. But Grace had learned to compartmentalize, to keep the two worlds separate while understanding how they intersected. Danny went into remission. He moved into an apartment near Grace, started taking online classes, talked about maybe going back to school for real. He was proud of his sister, the successful business consultant who'd built something from nothing. He never knew the full truth. Grace made sure of it. On the anniversary of that rainy night in the alley, Grace sat in her office, with her name on the door and her vision shaping the business, and thought about the journey she'd taken. She'd lost her innocence. She'd compromised her principles. She'd made deals with dangerous people and become someone she'd never imagined being. But she'd also saved her brother. She'd built a legitimate career. She'd found a strength in herself she hadn't known existed. Was it worth it? Grace looked at the photo on her desk. Her and Danny at his last doctor's appointment. Both of them smiling, both of them alive and hopeful and free. Yes, she thought. For this, it was worth it. Her phone buzzed. A text from Damien. Dinner tonight? There's an opportunity I want to discuss. Grace smiled slightly and typed back. 7 o'clock. I'll be there. She was no longer the desperate waitress trying to escape her life. She was Grace Monroe, business consultant, partner in an empire she didn't fully control, but had learned to navigate. She was no longer running from the cage. She'd learned to make it her own.